Hi everyone, I'm Erin Carswell, Foran's VP Exploration, and I'm thrilled as always to be able to bring you a video update. This one, the first one of 2026. Now, as you're all aware, there's been a lot going on at Foran in the last few months, and we do have a fair bit to update you with from an exploration perspective. Firstly, we have the results of our fall Tesla program from last year to talk about, and I'll step you through the expansion potential that we continue to see there. Secondly, we wanted to let you know that with 85 intersections now into the Tesla zone, and that's not even including Bridge Zone, we have enough to get started with now. We have sufficient drill density to be able to commence the maiden resource estimate. So we'll be targeting release of that in Q3 this year. Now, what that doesn't mean is that Tesla is closed out by any stretch. It's still going. The deepest holes we've drilled are still really strong in terms of mineralization, and we'll look at that today. But right now, we are going into a year of heightened focus on capital efficiency. We're going into the commissioning and ramp up of our first mine. So it doesn't make sense to be going out and drilling those huge, big, deep step-out holes, which are quite expensive, at a time when we have enough data to really get moving and support the studies that will underpin phase 2 expansions in future. So I hope that rationale makes sense. What it does allow us to do, though, is go back to regional exploration. So looking more at smaller scale exploration, shallower holes, but getting back to some of the advanced near mine targets that have been somewhat neglected in the last few years while we focused on other things. I'm going to be really happy to step you through our 3,000 metre winter program, starting with prospects such as Thunder and Flinty that we'll look at today as well. Now, before I jump into that, please have a read of the following forward-looking information statement, and then we'll get moving. Okay, so we'll start here at the claim scale, and astute observers will notice that this looks a little bit different to late last year. What we've done, and I'll grab my pen here, is add some claims in the north here. We call these the Granite Lake claims. What's interesting about these is that they were burnt last year, and what that often allows is for us to get in there in the 1 to 2 years after a burn and find outcrops that would have been inaccessible otherwise in the thick forest. So we'll be having geologists get out there and start to look at some historic anomalism, follow up on some historic prospects this summer. We'll address that more at a later date, but what we're going to do now is dive down into the scale of McIlvenna Bay and Tesla. You can see the Mac Bay outlined there in the red, projected to surface, and Tesla in the yellow. And then we'll drop underground, and you've got McIlvenna Bay there on the left, and the Tesla lenses I'll highlight in blue are these guys here. And what we're looking at on those hole traces, on those grey lines coming from surface, is copper equivalent assays. So you can see that we are, the drilling density at Tesla is really getting up there compared to McIlvenna Bay now. We're going to focus today, and you will have seen the press release come out today as well, and we're going to be focusing on this part of Tesla that I'm going to highlight in red down here, which is the kind of lowermost down dip edge of Tesla. And we were able to get another couple of holes into there from the fall program last year from a land-based pad on the opposite side of the lake. It's not normally something that we would be able to drill outside of winter, but there's one little area we can get to. Now, the interesting thing about this part of Tesla is that just further up dip, you can see that we didn't actually get fantastic results. And there was a part of Tesla where we were a bit confused for a little while there. We could see flooding with mafic intrusions. There was a bit of mineralization there, but not as strong as it normally was. So we were wondering what was happening. Now, these lower down dip holes that we did drill late last year were actually incredibly important for really showing us that the mineralization does pick up again in the down dip. And in fact, we're starting to see some of the most copper-rich intersections there that we've ever seen in the main lens. So that's really exciting for future expansion potential. And we'll dive in and have a bit of a look at what that actually means. So when we started putting everything together and looking at this area as a whole, we can see that there's actually a mafic intrusion sitting where those results were more subdued. On the lower edge of that, though, is where things pick up. So we'll start with hole TS2545 wedge 2 that you can see there on the left. That's the one that was part of today's press release. Fantastic intersection there of 7.7 metres running 2% copper, which for the main lens is about 4 times as much copper as we normally get. Also running 6% zinc, a little bit over 26 grams silver and nearly half a gram gold. Now, the other hole that you can see there on the right-hand side, TS2545 wedge 1, this was released late last year in a press release. However, we haven't actually mentioned it in a video. So not to labour a point, but that was an absolute ripper of an intersection. Now, We're talking about a main lens thickness there of 18.9 meters, running almost 1.4% copper, 5% zinc, and similar kind of silver and gold values as the previous intersection. But what's more important in that one is that there's 5.3 meters that runs over 4% copper. Now, that's almost unheard of in the main lens. You know, you do get little upgrades here and there, but that's a really solid copper-rich intersection and something that's quite unusual for the Tesla main lens. So that and the really good intersection in 45 wedge 2 is telling us that there's something fantastic happening at the lower edge of that mafic intrusion, and the mineralization has really picked up and could even be pooling underneath it or something like that. So what you're looking at on the actual lenses that we're showing here is copper grade thickness. So that's effectively just showing the intensity of copper mineralization across the main lens, which is the main one you can see there, and the lower lens underneath. And so I'll grab my little pen again here, showing that things are picking up under that mafic intrusion, still open in that direction down plunge. And of course, we still have this central corridor through the middle here of the higher grade copper, and even something going in this direction here. So there's still a lot to do to figure out what's controlling the copper at Tesla and why it's upgraded in certain parts of the main lens and not in others. But it is giving us a huge amount of confidence that those further down dip intersections could be really interesting. We do have evidence as well from borehole EM that there is a large plate in the down dip part of Tesla in that area. You can see how much further that could potentially extend the mineralization to, and that's not cut off at depth either. It's just that we can't see any further than that. I think it's still probably worth mentioning too that Tesla is certainly open here where I'm drawing. We certainly haven't cut off the mineralization in that orientation. We had some great copper results on the very southern edge of Tesla, particularly in the copper 2 lens there. They need to be followed up at some point in the future. And of course, in the down plunge direction as well. We'll be looking to expand in future too. So still heaps of work to do at Tesla in the years to come. It's definitely not cut off. You know, we think there's potential here for many more years of drilling to figure out how big this thing is. Anyway, just to finish off looking at the 45 wedge 2 intersections here, there was a sliver of copper 1 lens that sat above that nice main lens intersection. You can see there it's 1.1 meters, running about 1.7% copper. What's nice is because they sit on top of each other there, the main lens and the copper 1 lens, you'll be taking them together when they're mining. So it's just another bit of a copper kicker. And then the lower lens, again, we're starting to see that in that, or continuing to see that in that down dip position, the lower lenses are nice thicknesses and they do have really good grades. So you're looking at 6.5 meters there at 1% copper and 7.5% zinc. You can see the silver grades are elevated. They typically are down there in the lower lenses compared to the main lens further up, and also still running almost 0.4 grams gold. So those lower lenses are increasingly becoming important as we get deeper at Tesla. Now, I'm jumping back out here to the tenement scale. We're looking at the northern parts of our claims here. And we're going to start to look at the winter program, which is, as I mentioned, a 3,000 metre program that we've just started. We've got one rig turning out there at the moment. And we're going to dive down into Thunder and Balsam. Now, I'm just going to highlight where Tesla and Macarena Bay sit in blue. If you can see that shape there, they kind of sit through here. And we'll start looking at Thunder first. And you can see that there is a magnetic lineament. And I'm going to see if yellow works here. Extending down from Macarena Bay right down to where basically we have a little EM anomaly, which was picked from airborne EM. And in fact, I can show that on the next screen. And where there's been some historical results that we're going to have a look at now. Super interesting to be able to follow the Tesla zone down here to the southeast. We'll drop down to look at what this image actually is ground EM at this point. So we've obviously gone back in the past and followed up the airborne with the ground. You can see the anomaly there. And what's really interesting here is that the northernmost drill hole drilled on this trend, and we'll drop down underneath and have a look underground and see what that looks like in a minute. But this hit some really good mineralization. This was in 2015 that Foran drilled it. So there were 15 meters of mineralized rocks. We're including intersections such as almost 3.5 meters at 2% copper and nearly 3.5% zinc, with silver and gold that are really similar to what we see at Tesla. You know, you could interchangeably put that kind of intersection into Tesla. It also had 3.7 meters running at 0.7% copper and over 7% zinc. So again, we do get those copper-rich zones and those zinc-rich zones, just like Macarena Bay and Tesla. So we're probably looking at a really similar mineralizing system here. What we need to understand is what kind of scale potential does it have. So dropping down underground, and I'll explain some of the history here. So we have two prospects here really, Balsam and Thunder. Now Balsam, which I'm going to highlight in blue, were these holes up here, which were drilled. Actually, some of them were drilled in the early 1980s before McIlvenna Bay was even discovered. And obviously, once McIlvenna Bay was discovered, a lot of the investment and the focus in drill meters went into working up that resource over time, and Balsam was kind of left behind. And as you can see, there was mineralization there. It didn't all hang together perfectly, and some of the intersections were a bit skinny. But in 2015, Foran went back and followed up on a deeper EM anomaly. And this is where we're starting to look at what we call the thunder zone. As you can see, that final intersection, which I'm highlighting here in red, is completely open to the north. And in fact, if I go to the next slide, you'll see that we have modelled an EM plate plunging off towards the north there. And we do have a couple of holes to go and test whether that mineralisation could be intensifying with depth. We're hoping that it is. So we'll get back to you with news on that in future. Now, jumping back out to the regional scale as well, and we'll dive now back into Flinty. Now, this was an interesting area that we did actually drill. It was a target in 2022, and we did actually drill it just before we discovered Tesla. There is anomalism there, and we did intersect some kind of mineralisation system. So you can see these holes. Flinty 1 returned almost 7 metres, grading nearly 0.5% copper and 2.85% zinc, including some higher grade intervals within that. And then Flinty 3 returned 5.3 metres, grading just over 0.6% copper, and did have a 30 centimetre interval in there that graded over 5% copper. Now, again, we didn't release those at the time, but they are definitely indicative of a mineralizing system there. We don't know how strong or how weak it would be. And what it is evidence, though, is that the process is happening. We do have a mineralizing process here. So where in this area is the question now? Could this process have been stronger? Where could we be getting thicker intersections and more grade? So our target area, and I'll circle these again in blue, target areas for this year are the Flinty North anomalies. And you can see there in the red, these are actually magnetic anomalies, and they're not typically what we would use to target this style of mineralization. Normally we'd use EM or IP, but there are some parts of Tesla where the copper mineralization is quite intimately intergrown with magnetite as an accessory mineral. Now, of course, magnetite creates magnetic anomalies if you get enough of it in one place. So we're looking at these strange mag highs, which is subcircular and quite unusual along that trend, and wanting to go and put a couple of holes into those to see what they are. Anyway, so that's what we're doing this winter. There'll be a couple of other targets on the list as well. Super exciting for our team to get back to that kind of work. As you know, we do have a huge claims package. We'll zoom back out to that scale now. And it's our job now to take what we've learned from McIlvenna Bay and from Tesla and apply it back to really uncovering what we still believe could be a camp of deposits. Anyway, thank you for listening. Wish us luck. It's going to be another big year for Foran, and I look forward to getting back to you soon. Thanks so much. Bye.